Great. So I see people are still joining this webinar. Today is one of the more popular ones. I think whenever we speak about strategy, people are very, very interested. And especially with the new year coming up, we thought, why not combine a forward-looking webinar with the core skills on strategy. I think you studied strategy at some point at Cambridge as well, so you can combine both your strategy background and your pricing background. So I think quite an interesting one that we have for you today. Yeah, should we go start, Ingo?
Yeah, definitely. Were you talking about me or before?
Yes. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk about you and me as well. Yeah, so today's webinar is hosted by our founder, Ingo. If you've been to a webinar before, you know Ingo. He's got over 12 years experience in pricing and developed the Buynomics method. I think, interestingly, I mentioned your strategy background, so today we can combine both. And I'm Paul. I used to work in consulting, and I'm head of sales at Buynomics and also leading Buynomics insights and content initiatives. Yeah, so I think I'll hand over to you, Ingo, for this webinar. And if you have any questions, just write them in the chat. It's at the bottom, the little speech bubble, or you can ask anonymously in the Q&A, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And Ingo and I will answer those questions towards the end of the webinar. So with no further ado, Ingo, you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, also for the introduction and for leading us into the topic. So I'm thrilled about the webinar because it combines two things that I've already spent quite some time on in my life: pricing, more recently, and before that, strategy, where I had wrote my PhD thesis and taught. It wasn't at Cambridge; it was here in Germany, Cologne, and then later at Oxford for some time. All right, so let's get started and with the actual topic. So before we talk about pricing strategy, I think it makes sense to just briefly touch on strategy, because it's one of the terms where you that have very different meanings, and I think it's helpful to clarify what we want. And it seems to me that most of the dichotomy play between two figures. One is, as we've shown here with the Trojan horse on the left side, it's trickery. So I think one of the quotes I like most is what is strategy, and the trickery means strategy is if you're out of ammunition, but you keep right on firing so that your enemies won't know it. So that's the one side of strategy. And I think the other side is formal planning. I think one of the earlier sources for this formal planning in business strategy, but in war strategy, is Karl von Clausewitz on war, where he goes into broad detail on how to conduct war, how to plan operations, and so on. So, and I think there are these two facets of strategy that are important also for us. I think often also when we work with our clients and they use our tool, and previously when I was in consulting, many are hoping for some trick, some silver bullet that will save the day. But in most cases, the solution actually comes more from the hard work, from the planning. And that's also something that we want to support with our solution to make it much easier and much more effective. Something like in baseball, I think trickery, it's a bit like stealing bases. It's something that can save the day, but if you look at it from a statistical point of view, it's almost always not a good idea to attempt it. And this is the dichotomy that we live in with strategy. And now let's go deeper into the actual topic of pricing strategy. When we look at strategy, and I find this a particularly useful framework to address and then also work with strategy, is something that goes back to Richard Rummel, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book. I highly recommend, not just for pricing, but for strategy in general. And I think there are three elements that are key to it, and that we also want to use to now in this webinar go through the topic. The first one, obviously, diagnosis. You can't solve a problem unless you have understood what the challenges are. So every good strategy starts with a proper diagnosis. The second one is then defining guiding policy, defining the objectives. Do you want to aim for profit maximization, revenue maximization, or other things? That needs to be defined. And then in the third part, coherent action. So you need to have the proper organization, pricing organization, and so on, to actually implement the strategy. And that can be very simple. If you want to increase the price from, I don't know, €1 to €2, that's obviously much easier than moving from selling products to usage-based pricing, for example, that has many implications on technology, processes, and so on. But I think it makes sense to go through the pricing strategy within these three steps. Diagnosis. I think, and of course, we can only touch this on a very high level. And I'm happy if you see that we have missed something here that is new and relevant for pricing, and that has different effects on pricing strategy, and so on. But I think these are the key trends. Most of them already started in the current year, but that will also be, some of them will increase in relevance. Some hopefully, like the pandemic, reduce in relevance in the coming year. But these are the driving forces also for pricing strategy, because they affect us very directly. So it's, from our point of view, the pandemic, then also for pricing, of course, very important, the topic of inflation. In some countries, we have the highest, something like 30 or 40 years by now. And we have regulatory changes like ESG legislation, for example, that directly affects the way companies can do pricing, in terms of that certain things are not allowed anymore, certain marketing campaigns or certain discounts may not be allowed anymore, or you have a carbon tax and you have to deal with it in some way in your own pricing as well. Then there are technological changes, like, for example, you have 5G in telecommunications that adds a new feature to products. And the question, of course, is how do you price it? How do you include it in your current portfolio? Do you introduce a new technology in all your products, or maybe only in the top products, and so on? These are all very direct and immediate pricing challenges. And I think also what we find rather important is the last point here, capital market requirements, because we see that different types of revenues are valued very differently in the capital market. So, for example, recurring revenue. So if you have a recurring business model, that seems to be valued much more highly than just selling products, and that affects many companies. And famous example is probably Adobe, that when they switched from selling individual products to a subscription model, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I think their stock price multiplied by a factor of 16, something like that, not immediately, but over a longer period of time. Yeah. So business models are becoming highly relevant. So we see many companies, and that's also maybe something that's interesting for you, that have, if they have the opportunity to move from selling products to a subscription, diaper subscription, or other subscriptions are also, of course, candidates, then this is something to be considered, and where pricing can add immediate benefit to the value of the company. So these are the major trends. If you think we missed something, we're very happy to discuss these in the end of this webinar. So how do these affect pricing? Our point of view, very put together these different trends that we're seeing currently into the heart of pricing. So the demand, supply and demand graphs. So we have here in this graph, I think you're all familiar with it. We have price, we have volume. If price increases, volume goes down. We have some cost here, and whatever is between price, cost times volume is the profit that we have in the end. And then certain limitations. So for example, from COVID, where certain things are limited, we see that this might affect, not in this graph, but it might affect at some point the amount of of sales that are possible. So in Germany, we're now limiting the number of people that can go into the stadium, for example. So this has direct effect on the sales volume and price relationship. Also, other regulations might limit the amount of products you can sell if you're not allowed to do certain things anymore. And then, of course, you have also a shift in demand curves. Some industries benefit from the pandemic. They benefit from regulations. They benefit from technological advancements like 5G, for example. Some things like regulation, inflation affect everyone's cost. And of course, you have, driven by capital markets and also maybe by technology, the ability to introduce new business models, something like a usage-based pricing. And one famous example is, for example, Rolls-Royce, when they went from selling turbines to selling, essentially renting them out by flown kilometer. That of course is only possible when you have the ability to actually track the actual usage of your product. So some of these are more challenging, and of course, all of the trends that we discussed affect our fundamental pricing hard at core. And even something that looks trivial at first sight actually often isn't. So I think most of you are being faced with a challenge, particularly in the past month. You have a cost increase of a certain amount, 3, 4, 5, 6%, for example. And the question is, how do you deal with the cost increase? Do you pass it on, and how much will you pass on? And the thing is that it's not sufficient to just know price elasticity, for example, or to know the current demand, but actually it matters what type of demand function you have. So how the demand function is shaped matters greatly. And just to highlight this point, we have here in this example two standard demand functions that I think most of you will be familiar with, that are quite common in pricing. So linear demand, so with every increase in the price of, say, €1, you lose the same amount of sales in absolute sales, or exponential demand, where you have a constant price elasticity over the whole range, and where you increase the price by a certain percentage, you always lose the same percentage in sales. And so these are two very standard demand functions, and actually here they kind of look the same for a narrow margin, but the implications of a cost increase, for example, are quite different. So in the optimum of the linear demand function, you have this equation, so the optimal price depending on cost, and the demand here, A and B, which are the parameters that define the linear demand, is C over 2 times this term here. That means that if you have, for example, a 10%, or you have a €10 increase in cost, you pass on half of that cost increase in your price. So if your price before was optimal and you have a €10 increase here, you pass on €5 and you're optimal again in your pricing. Whereas in the exponential demand here, you have, for example, a 10% increase. Here you pass on that 10%. So every increase you have here in percent, you pass on to your price. And if you take this as a specific example, and you have a cost increase from 100 to 110, and your current price is 200, so price elasticity in your current price is -2, you will, in the case of linear demand, increase price by 5%, and exponential demand by 20, not by 5%, by €5, and by exponential demand, you will increase it by €20. So your cost increased by 10, and the suggestion using two very common demand functions ranges from 5 to €20. So that's quite a big range. And if you tell that to your boss, then it's probably not the answer he or she was looking for. So even something so trivial as passing on a certain cost increase can be actually very, very difficult. And here we're just in a one product case, so there's no competition, no portfolio, nothing. It's already quite difficult. And that was, of course, one of the motivations for us to build the tool. And we just want to build our solution, and we just want to take a look at more realistic cases for now. So just let me switch my screen. Or can you see my browser?
Yes, if you can zoom in a little bit, then I think that's perfect.
This?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
The Zoom stuff here covers up quite a large amount space
Yeah,
on my screen.
exactly.
So let's see if I can handle it. All right, so let's take a very simple example. So we're selling apples. We've done that before in webinars, so most of you are hopefully familiar. And we're selling 5 kilogram bags. Selling them 5 kilograms for 9.99 currently. It costs €5. Nothing else. Just take a quick look at what that means. And the demand is on average, we're roughly okay with our demand. If we go to we're selling 496 units at this price here. And if, for example, we increase the price by 20 cents, we lose 20 customers, but our percentage margin increases, but our profit decreases. So let's see what happens if we decrease our price, profit increases. And when we go to the optimum, we see that our profit optimum in this case is at 939. We can validate that with just a second. So we have here our full demand curve. See that we have the revenue optimum is still below the price, but we're here somewhere close to the profit optimum. So there's at 939 we have the optimum, but these prices are all pretty much the same in terms of profitability. So, but anyway, the 939 difficult number is the profit optimum in this case. But we're actually more interested in changes. So the question is now, so we're just selling regular apples and we now want to be ESG compliant with our apples. So let's add that to this, and doing that, all the paperwork and so on costs us an extra €1, but it might be worth it. So let's see if we add this, because people value this extra attribute maybe to some extent. Some do, some don't. But the way we set it up is on average, and this is also suggested by actual data, is that most people value it. And we can see again, if we look at what happens, we start again at the same price, $9.99. We increase the price and our profit increases. So we're probably below profit optimum. Let's validate that here with our profit curve, and we see that the profit is a bit higher here. Let's go directly to the profit optimum in this case, and we see that we're at $11.99 at the profit optimum. So we can charge a much higher price than in the previous case, and that gives us the ability, or maybe the ability, to actually achieve a higher profit. Remember that we had to pay we had some extra costs that came from the ESG case. So let's look at these two cases. So we have the base case, the first, so just the apples here. In the profit optimum, we sell these 568 units. We have the ESG compliant case where we sell at $11.99, higher price, sell fewer units, but we have a higher percentage margin, and we see that we sell fewer units, but actually our revenue is higher and our profit is also higher. So this is a very easy way to look at this trivial example, and we might actually also ask ourselves what happens if we offer both apples. So the regular apple at, and this again, the profit maximum, if we offer both, we would offer it $9.59, and the more expensive one, the ESG conform apple at $11.99, and that would allow us to be a little bit more profitable if we have both of these products. And this is just a very simple example to highlight how to look at these cases. And I think this already highlights the basic logic, but of course, this is not a realistic example. But if we apply the same logic to a more realistic example, so we have the case where we are not looking just at two apples, or two different types of apples, but we look at a full portfolio where we have 4 products and we have two competitors who add another three products, we see that we can and use something like this to answer the same questions. And if you try to do that by hand, which I don't recommend, you see that, for example, if you have a price increase in this one product here, you lose sales, but some of these sales go to your own product portfolio, and at some point you will also lose sales to competitors. Would be very difficult to figure out by hand or to figure out with an Excel solution, for example. But something like this allows you to have full transparency on what happens if you, for example, go from non-ESG compliant offers to ESG compliant offers. And then again, as before, you can ask yourself, if I have the base case that we just looked at, and then we have the ESG compliant case where all of the products are ESG compliant, keep the same prices, how would that affect my sales? You see that we would have significantly higher sales, also higher revenue and higher profit. And there might be a combination where say, let's have some products ESG compliant and others not, if that's an option to look at. And of course, you can also, this was a CPG example, you can of course do the same logic with something like a telco example, software example, where in telco you introduce maybe new technology like 5G or something else that you some subscription to Netflix or other things that you want to consider adding to your portfolio. And you can use something like this to make these decisions. And you see that once it's set up, these things can be done very, very quickly. So this was just a quick demonstration of how these things can be done. Let's go back to the presentation.
Ingo, we had a question about the solution in terms of what is called customers or retailers in CPG space. Maybe you can address that in the demo really quickly, because someone was asking. So 1 second. Given most of pricing is constrained by customer, retailer, ecosystem, and agreed during JBP, is there a view that allows us to simulate impact not only on own P&L, but customer P&L as well? So maybe you can quickly show the...
Yeah, I think, the back and forth would be difficult, but in general, yeah, so this solution here allows you to look at the impact on retailers and yourself, if that's what you have. You can also add wholesalers, any level that's relevant for your business, and you can see how that affects all parties. If you and you can also look at how certain things that you do would affect your competitors, for example, and you can then of course also simulate what would be a likely response from your competitors. It might be that some moves or changes that you make sense under the assumption that your competitor doesn't react, but that don't make sense if the competitor reacts, and vice versa. So sometimes a price increase doesn't make sense, but if it's likely that a competitor follows, then it might be better if you do the price increase. So these things are all doable, and this, for example, allows you to have full transparency on what's happening in your market and how certain decisions and certain trends that become available. And we've seen that the trends that we identified, they all play nicely into the pricing topics we have. They can add new features to your products. They might limit your abilities to use certain discounts, for example, but everything is really integrated into the core of the pricing equation. And what we demonstrated was in the very simple example, in the one product cost increase, that it's already difficult to do such calculations by hand, but now there's technology available that allows you to answer these questions also in a complex and realistic environment.
Yeah, and because there was a little bit of a conversation around retailer.
Should we do that now, or should we wait? Should we finish first?
Yeah, we can do that at the end, sure.
All right, so just to quickly wrap up here, I think we mostly spoke about the first part, the diagnosis. So what are the key trends and how can they be addressed? And I think that's also for particularly for short webinar what's most interesting. But of course, we saw in the beginning that there are two more parts of strategy. It's the guidelines and the implementation. And I think particularly important, having spent a lot of time in pricing with pricing organizations, is the first part. So you always need to be sure what your objectives are. Are you optimizing for profit? Are you optimizing for revenue? When pressed, most say looking for profitable growth, which is something in between. But if it's that, it's very important to be very specific what you're aiming for, so that you also have the chance, or give the organization a chance, to optimize what you're aiming for. And this needs to be clarified so that everyone knows there's a trade-off between profit and revenue, that you're not aiming for both, because then in the end you will probably miss both. So that rather you're aware of the trade-off and know where you want to get in the end. And of course, then the final step is the implementation. It can be very trivial if you increase the price from €1 to €1.10. That of course doesn't have typically massive organizational implications. But if you want to move from selling products, for example, to usage-based pricing, as in the turbine example that I mentioned in the beginning, that can have massive implications. It might affect your processes, your financing. It might affect your organization, and you of course need the proper technology to track usage of your products. So these are important to keep in mind, and we find it very helpful, and I think we also have it on our website, to use a framework like this that makes sure that you're not missing anything important, and guides you through the relevant steps in setting up your pricing strategy, from diagnosis, guidelines, and implementation. And of course, it makes sense to support this with technology, and the solution we offer is one that is very useful for that. Also in the diagnosis, understanding what the challenges are, how the challenges affect your business, and then later on also in the implementation, integrating it into the proper processes and getting it implemented through the organization. And I want to close before we get to the Q&A, because we're currently in the middle of the Chess World Championship, and I think this feeds nicely into the relationship between strategy and technological support that we already touched on in the beginning. And I think that many challenges that are traditionally thought of as strategic aren't really strategic. So for example, in chess, when a human looks at the position, might think that with the right strategy, you can win it. For a computer, it's just a checkmate in 21 moves. So, and that means that many aspects. So, and if you look at the solution we showed previously, is that many aspects of pricing can be solved by technology. So the computer can do the heavy lifting in terms of analysis, and then you as a pricing manager can deal with the real strategic issues of what to do, how to deal with competition and so on, and leave the optimization, the calculation to the machine. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ingo. We had a few questions coming up in the chat, so I just want to address them. There was one from Yuri about price thresholds and how we treat them and how we know the elasticity in each threshold and what our knowledge, where that knowledge is coming from. And I answered that we have done some research about it, but do you want to kind of go into more detail around that?
Yeah, price thresholds is a broad topic, and we'll probably have something on that in early next year. So the solution that we have includes price thresholds. So for example, at 1, 2, 3 euros, something like that. One thing that we observe in reality, and that we also observe with our solution, is that the effect of price thresholds decreases if you go from looking at a single product, as you typically do in a survey, to looking at a full market where customers can choose between a couple dozen products. You will see that price thresholds become much less relevant as in the one product case that's typically looked at in surveys. And they often give, that's something we see, a false impression of how relevant these price thresholds will actually be later on in a full market. But we'll have something on that in the new year, where we want to go into more details on the topic. Maybe I think our next webinar is on fairy tales in pricing, and this might be one thing that we also want to include in that one.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, Pratik is just adding to that question, whether we basically have an ambition to estimate this dynamically based on econometric modeling rather than research. And I think that's basically my understanding of what the algorithm does anyway. So it has a different elasticity, a different price threshold indication for each product, for each price point even. So it's quite dynamic like that already. And all the relevant factors that shoppers take into account are taken into account by the model as well. I had another question. Let me just look that one up. Yeah, I think there was also a short discussion about you know, the retailer that you already answered in terms of how we take that into account. But there was also Yuri who responded, doesn't the customer, i.e. the retailer, always go where the shoppers go? So right, so do you have to optimize for the customer or for the end shopper? And do you kind of want to chime in on that debate?
Yeah, so the solution, I said customer in many cases. In the CPG world, I meant shopper. So what matters here is if the price or the product in the shelf and what shoppers and customers will buy in the end. This is the perspective we have here. What we didn't show, but what we briefly touched, is you can also include the manufacturer retailer relationship in terms of net pricing, bonus, discounts, and so on. So this is another perspective that we didn't go into detail now, but that's also included.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think we mentioned the next webinar. Do you quickly want to go to that slides? I also posted our email address in the chat. The next one, you will get an invite by email. Someone asked if we can share the recording and the slides by email, and everyone will get those as well. And then if you're interested in learning more about, you know, price thresholds and other potential myths that we can debunk in pricing, then I encourage you to register for the December 17 webinar on that topic as well. I think we have no further questions at this point, so I wish everyone a happy weekend. Thanks, Ingo, for hosting. I think this was quite an interesting one again, especially relating to the chess world championships. I'm not sure which stage are we in. Is it the finals yet? I haven't followed it yet, but
yeah, it's the final. So I think it's game 6 going on today.
Okay, yeah, quite interesting. I have to catch up on it. Match. Is Magnus Carlsen still the favorite by far, or is it someone else?
Yeah, I think that's where we should cut it.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good weekend, and yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you also again in the next one. This will be the last before Christmas. Yeah, and I think this is going to be an interesting one again, a bit more off topic, I would say, where we're not taking the field too seriously, but we can promise that it will be interesting.
Cool.
Thanks. Have a good weekend.